textbook example of an oligarch.
Russian oligarchs.
Russian oligarchs have mind-boggling wealth.
The richest Russians, the power brokers who now run what were once state-owned industries in the Soviet Union.
The Russian oligarchy, a handful of powerful men who own the vast amount of the country's wealth. And make no mistake, with natural resources valued at over $75 trillion, Russia could be one of the richest countries on the planet. Yet most of its people will never see a penny of it. Instead, it funds the lavish lifestyles of the ultra-wealthy Russian elite. These are not the 1%, they are the 0.1%. People who earn more in a few seconds than most could make in a year. So how did so much end up in the hands of so few? This is the shocking true story of how a small group of unscrupulous businessmen stole the wealth of an entire nation. That takes place in the ashes of an empire. Christmas Day 1991. But the people in the West are not opening their presents. Instead, they are watching the impossible. The Soviet flag being lowered over the Kremlin for the last time. Earlier that day, Mikhail Gorbachev, the president of the Soviet Union, had resigned. With the stroke of a pen, a global superpower had just disappeared.
Я покидаю свой пост с тревогой, но и с надеждой, с верой в вас, вашу мудрость и силу духа. Мы наследники великой цивилизации, и сейчас от всех и каждого зависит, чтобы она возродилась к новой, современной и достойной жизни.
With this one act, the former communist countries of the USSR were now free to determine their own fate. And for millions of people, their lives were about to be turned upside down. Boris Yeltsin, the newly elected president of the Russian Federation, was many things. A bear of a man who loved to drink. He often found himself at the center of controversy, but he was seen as a man of the people and a champion for reform. To put it simply, Yeltsin was very popular. And he recognized this moment as a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity for real change. For years he had watched as the West had prospered and Russia had only suffered under communism. He was determined to break away from the stagnation and inefficiency of the Soviet-era centrally planned economy and bring about economic growth and prosperity through capitalism. But for Yeltsin, it was about more than economics. He believed that freedom and capitalism were intertwined, and that by changing the Russian economy into a free market system, he could also bring freedom back to a people who hadn't seen it in over 70 years. It was an ambitious plan, but the truth was, he had no idea if he'd be in power long enough to do it. The situation in Russia was unstable, and communism still had widespread support. He needed to act quickly. So, he and his team came up with a plan to rapidly dismantle the institutions that made the old Soviet system possible and push the economy onto the path of capitalism whether the people liked it or not. The plan was called economic shock therapy, but it had a disastrous start. Under communism, the government controlled most aspects of people's lives, but it had an iron grip on the economy. The state owned all businesses, set prices for goods, and even controlled trade. The problem was, they weren't very good at it. So by the time Yeltsin took over, the economy was in freefall. Yeltsin's first step was to open the Russian economy up to the rest of the world. He removed import restrictions, state subsidies, and critically, the price caps that artificially kept the costs of goods low. And prices immediately skyrocketed. People began to panic and rushed to buy as much as they could, causing a surge in demand that the old Soviet industrial sector was too inefficient to keep up with, which drove up inflation by 2,600%, wiping out the savings of most Russians. And to make matters worse, the value of the ruble was also plummeting. Whilst under Soviet control, the government had imposed a fixed exchange rate, so that $1 would always buy 0.63 rubles. But as a part of his market reforms, Yeltsin had released centralized control, and now the ruble could be freely traded, and it sank like a stone to 2,000 rubles per dollar. The average Russian was not only poorer, but now their money also bought them less. But this was only the beginning for Russia's problems. And in this time of chaos and uncertainty, the first oligarchs would begin to emerge. By the end of 1992, Yeltsin's popularity is in decline, and people are already starting to lose faith in capitalism. Yeltsin desperately needed to get the public on board, and so he, along with his deputy prime minister Anatoly Shabayas, devised a plan to make the people into shareholders. The government owned tens of thousands of businesses, ranging from supermarkets to oil refineries, that they needed to put into public hands as quickly as possible. But they didn't want to just sell them to the highest bidder. They wanted to give ordinary Russian people the chance to be involved. That way, they would feel invested in their future and be less likely to want to return to communism. They decided to print vouchers that would be given to everyone in the country that could be exchanged at auctions for shares in whatever company they wanted. It was a noble idea, but the process would be fraught with problems and allegations of corruption. Each voucher was given a value of 10,000 rubles, but by the time they were distributed, inflation had destroyed it, leaving them worth about $25. And the Russian people saw this as an insult. On top of that, for the last 70 years, they had been told that financial assets like shares were nothing more than worthless pieces of paper, and so many didn't want to get involved. Others were worried about being punished if the Communist Party came back to power. So many Russians were happy to sell theirs, some for as little as a bottle of vodka. And there were a few opportunistic businessmen who had the cash to take advantage.
Ты ему давал $10 000, и он с удовольствием их брал и подписывал бумажку, потому что он ни секунды не верил, что этот завод останется частным. Он считал, что все равно через несколько месяцев придут красные, да, и опять все заберут.
Corrupt government officials, members of the Russian mafia, and shady entrepreneurs that operated within the black market had amassed fortunes under communism. Others got rich by taking advantage of legal methods. In the dying years of the Soviet Union, Gorbachev had made it legal for ordinary people to start businesses. And many of the men who would go on to become oligarchs made modest fortunes by taking advantage of the lack of competition and oversight. And now these men are on a spending spree. Anyone with any money to spare scoured the nation, buying up as many vouchers as possible. Most Russians, squeezed by inflation, were happy to sell. Others were intimidated into doing so, and a huge amount was stolen in voucher investment schemes, which were Ponzi's that lured people in with the promise of high returns. Through these methods, and many more, a few well-off men managed to gather huge piles of privatization vouchers, and were easily able to outbid anyone else at the auctions. Not that it would have mattered anyway, as most of them were rigged in the first place. Bribing officials was commonplace. Some were held in obscure locations, making it difficult for people to attend, and others were even controlled by the mafia, who had men outside controlling who could come in. Some of these men even put hits out on their rivals. It was chaos, leading to a wave of murders that kick-started a decade of violence. During this time, hugely profitable companies worth millions were acquired at auction for a few $100,000. everything from factories to oil refineries, television networks to shipping companies. It was all up for grabs, and the money was rolling in. Some of the richest Russians even pulled their money together to create banks and began to use their customers' deposits to buy even more shares in even bigger companies, which was unethical but not illegal. The Russian government was moving so fast that laws were unclear and contradictory. By taking advantage of this, the wealth of an entire nation had begun to flow into the pockets of a few opportunistic men. But this was only a small taste of what was to come. By 1995, Yeltsin's popularity was at record lows. Inflation, corruption, murders on the streets of Moscow. Capitalism was supposed to improve the lives of Russians, but Yeltsin's reforms just made them worse. Over the last few years, protests and civil unrest had often turned violent, and Yeltsin had even been forced to fire on the Russian parliament building after an attempted coup. By now, 70% of the country's businesses had been privatized, and yet they were still on the brink of bankruptcy. On top of that, the Russian government had borrowed almost $90 billion since the end of communism, money that they were unable to pay back. In the eyes of the Russian people, privatization had been a failure, and many were calling for a return to communism. Yeltsin's government was facing a financial crisis, and they desperately needed to raise capital, but they couldn't afford to take out any more loans. However, they still owned some of the largest businesses, massive companies from across the oil, gas and mining sectors, banking, transportation and telecoms, the most profitable companies of the Soviet era. They decided to use them to secure loans, and contacted a group known as the Seven Bankers. By using government connections, ruthless business practices, and even murdering their competition, these men had taken over undervalued companies during the early stages of privatization and made fortunes. And now the government was coming to them begging for money. Under a plan called Shares for Loans, the government would use their shares as collateral for private loans, with the deal being that if the government defaulted on the debt, the banks could sell the shares at auctions to repay the loan. After pooling their money and using their influence and connections to include other wealthy businessmen in the deal, the Seven Bankers agreed. And Yeltsin's government received the capital it desperately needed to survive. But the money had strings attached. When the debt came due, Yeltsin's government defaulted. And as agreed, the banks sold off the shares. But once again, these auctions were rigged, with many being won by members of the bank's board for shockingly low prices. But this was no accident. 1996 was an election year, and it looks like Yeltsin would lose to his opponent, Gennady Zyuganov, a communist. There was a real danger that with this one election, everything would be undone. And the truth was, they needed each other. Without the oligarchs' money, Yeltsin didn't stand a chance. And if the communists came back to power, the oligarchs wouldn't just lose everything, they'd be thrown in prison. So they came to a deal. Behind closed doors, Shabayas negotiated on Yeltsin's behalf. In exchange for total control of the country's most profitable industries, the oligarchs would pump millions into Yeltsin's re-election campaign, use their media networks to spread his propaganda, and even agreed to funnel money from the government's accounts into his own to help him win. And it worked. In a narrow victory, Yeltsin won. During this time, state assets worth billions were sold for a fraction of their real value. The oligarchs took control of entire industries, creating massive fortunes. They were also now a key part of politics, and were able to influence policies to benefit themselves. Russia was under their total control. But this was not the end in their story. Because despite all their money, influence and power, not all of the oligarchs would be allowed to keep their fortunes. By the late 90s, Yeltsin's health had deteriorated. The public blamed him for much of the country's problems, and it was clear that his time in politics was rapidly coming to an end. The oligarchs needed a replacement. Their success in the 1996 election had shown how effective they were at manipulating Russian politics, and if they could do it once, they could do it again. Their plan was simple. Pick a complete unknown, someone who they could control, and elevate them to the highest office in the country. So, in 1999, Yeltsin and a group of oligarchs hand-picked an obscure former KGB agent named Vladimir Putin, a nobody who had a reputation for loyalty, and appointed him Prime Minister, the second most important role in government. And then it was time for Yeltsin to step aside.
За то, что не оправдал некоторых надежд тех людей, которые верили, что мы одним махом, одним рывком, одним знаком сможем перепрыгнуть с серого, застойного.
Less than 5 months later, Yeltsin resigned, and Putin, without a single vote being cast, automatically became president. And his first official act was to grant Boris Yeltsin a full pardon for any crimes that he may have committed during his time as president. Putin's ascension may have looked like a win for the oligarchs, but everything was not as it seemed. Soon after he was in power, federal agents raided the offices of NTV, one of the country's largest television networks, and took control. The Kremlin alleged that the network's owner, Vladimir Kaczynski, a man who had been instrumental in Putin's election campaign, had embezzled funds during its privatization. But the network only became a target after it broadcast a satirical puppet show that openly mocked and criticized Putin. Kaczynski was jailed and then fled overseas, leaving much of his fortune behind. A message had been sent. In the summer of 2000, Putin summoned 21 of the richest men in Russia to the Kremlin for a historic meeting. Their wealth had allowed them to manipulate politics during the Yeltsin years and operate with impunity. But now, their newly elected president wanted to tell them that things had changed. And so, behind closed doors, he offered the oligarchs a deal. Stay out of politics, and you can keep all of your money, mansions, and yachts. But go against me and face the entire might of Russia. The oligarchs had been outmaneuvered. But after years of calling the shots, some of them didn't take the warning seriously. Russia's richest man, Mikhail Khodorkovsky, tried to regain power by creating his own political party. He ended up stripped of his businesses and most of his wealth, rotting in a Siberian prison for almost a decade. And then there was Boris Berezovsky, one of the original 7 bankers, and the man widely credited with Putin's rise to power. He had to flee the country and was forced to sell off most of his assets after he openly criticized Putin in public. In both cases, as with many others, their companies and fortunes were simply taken away and given to Putin loyalists. The time of the oligarchs and the government working together were over. A new era of Russian politics had begun. The surviving oligarchs, who had risen to power in a time of uncertainty, using corruption, threats, and murder, were still all billionaires. The only difference was, now they had a king.